Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ken Yalowitz. I'm the director of the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding here at Dartmouth, and I'm delighted to see this very, very large crowd today. The weather today is probably a little atypical for the Arctic, but I think tomorrow we're going to be getting very typical weather, so just hang on. This occasion today is a very, very special one, the Stefansson Memorial Lecture, which is being jointly sponsored by the Stefansson Arctic Institute of Iceland and the Dickey Center and its Institute of Arctic Studies. The Dickey Center, which is going to be celebrating its 25th anniversary next February, seeks to ensure that a rigorous understanding of global problems is an essential part of the Dartmouth experience. We conduct public programs and conferences addressing the great issues of our day and challenge our students and community to confront them. This work memorializes the ideas and vision of John Sloan Dickey, the president of Dartmouth from 1945 through 1970, during the very crucial post-World War II era. A strong area of interest of President Dickey was northern and polar regions, especially Canada. We have also been inspired by the explorations, research, and vision of Vilhjalmur Stefansson, whom we honor today, and who founded Dartmouth's Northern Studies program. Today, we all recognize that the polar regions have profound significance for the Earth's climate, ecosystems, and societies. For that reason, the Dickey Center and the Institute of Arctic Studies have made as one of our top research and programmatic activities the subject of climate change and its effects on the social, cultural, and political dimensions of the North as an area of critical societal importance. Dartmouth is very well placed to pursue this research on an interdisciplinary basis, and we look forward to cooperating and working with the Stefansson Arctic Institute, interested colleges and universities, non-governmental organizations, representatives of indigenous peoples, and policymakers in this very important endeavor. I would now like to introduce Professor Ross Virginia, Professor of Environmental Studies at Dartmouth and Director of the Dickey Center's Institute of Arctic Studies. Ross?
Welcome, everyone. It's wonderful to see such a great turnout today. Today we're here to recognize the accomplishments and celebrate the legacy of Vilhjalmur Stefansson, Arctic explorer, adventurer, anthropologist, book collector, college teacher, mentor, and Dartmouth legend. Stefansson's long career in Arctic studies began in earnest 1 century ago when he journeyed to the Mackenzie River Delta in Canada. This trip profoundly influenced his life and changed our understanding forever of the North and its people. Stefansson, as Arctic consultant at the college, inspired a generation of students in the 50s and 60s who went on to become leaders in Northern studies. Together with his wife, Mrs. Evelyn Stefansson-Neff, who we're very honored to have with us today, they amassed and cataloged the world's largest collection of books and manuscripts on Arctic exploration. The Stefansson Special Collection lives today in Ronner Library and is a treasure for the international academic community. Worldwide, there are really two institutions that have a special identity and hold Stefansson near. One is Dartmouth College, and the other is the Stefansson Arctic Institute of Iceland. I'm very delighted that Dr. Niels Einarsson, director of the Stefansson Institute, is with us today, along with international visitors from Canada, the United Kingdom, Iceland, and other U.S. polar institutions. The Institute of Arctic Studies at Dartmouth was founded in 1989 and in recognition of the college's long and distinguished tradition in Northern studies. The Institute links Dartmouth faculty and associates to develop research and, importantly, to engage students in the social, political, and scientific issues that face polar regions. Personally, I think our most gratifying activity is to award Stefansson fellowships to cold-loving Dartmouth students. They conduct highly original research throughout the circumpolar north, reaching distant locations in Alaska, the Canadian Arctic, Greenland, and Iceland. And it's truly amazing what they were able to do. On a personal note, this is a very exciting time to be engaged in polar issues and polar science. March 2007 marks the beginning of the upcoming International Polar Year. This will be a tremendous international effort with the objective to rapidly advance polar science. I'm very proud that the Dickey Center and the Institute of Arctic Studies are major players in this event and have many interesting activities planned for the International Polar Year. And let me just highlight two. During the upcoming winter and spring terms, exhibition space in the Hood Museum will be devoted to Arctic studies and Arctic themes. The featured exhibit will be Thin Ice, Inuit Traditions Within a Changing Environment. It will feature Arctic objects, photographs, and art from the Hood Museum and the Stefansson Special Collection. So look forward to that. In March, Dartmouth will host the Arctic Science Summit Week. This is a very important conference. It's a kickoff event for the International Polar Year in the United States. Approximately 200 eminent scientists and policymakers from all of the Arctic nations and other nations will be here in Hanover to discuss ways to increase international cooperation in all areas of Arctic science. In fall of 2003, along with Ambassador Yalowitz and Professor Lenore Grenoble, I had the opportunity to travel to Iceland. We met with Iceland's President, Grimson, and with today's co-host, Dr. Niels Einarsson, Director of the Stefansson Arctic Institute. Our visit was aimed to expand cooperation between Dartmouth and Iceland, and today's lecture is very much a measure of that success. Dr. Einarsson is a noted social scientist who studies the human dimensions of Arctic environmental problems. He is the co-organizer and a lead author of the Arctic Human Development Report. This is a major scientific study prepared while Iceland chaired the Arctic Council. This report is a globally significant document. It's a seminal document that speaks to sustainable development issues for the Arctic, and it's become the keynote document for planning the social science agenda of the International Polar Year. Niels, we're very honored to have you here today, and I'd like to welcome you to Dartmouth College.
Thank you, Ross, and thank you all for this opportunity to come here and speak to you. I will try and
Can't hear you.
can't hear it louder. I'll is it better? Or do you hear my voice if I raise it? It's low technology, but it usually works. Sorry? That's okay. I just want to tell you a couple of words about the Stefansson Memorial Lectures, and then go on to describe sort of joint ventures and activities, projects that my institute, the Stefansson Institute, has had with Dartmouth College. There it comes. And there was a Dartmouth professor who was our first speaker in the series, Professor Oren Young, with whom I have had an excellent relationship and cooperation, but he is one of a series of high-profile or eminent scholars. We've also had the Governor General of Canada, Adrian Clarkson, President Grimson, the Icelandic president, who was here exactly 4 years ago in this very same auditorium. And we've had the foreign minister of Sweden, and now we are extremely lucky to have a prominent reporter from the New York Times. I will get back to the New York Times connection with Stefansson in a minute. Now, just very briefly about the joint project we have had with with Dartmouth College, and all of them have something in common denominators, basically an interest in human-environmental relations, an interdisciplinary approach to people in the Arctic and the relationship between human systems and natural systems. We worked together setting up the University of the Arctic, which is becoming a very prominent institution for capacity building for Arctic residents. We produced the Arctic Human Development Report, which has become a major document adopted by the United Nations Development Programme as a regional report, as well as being seen as a textbook and a comprehensive summary of how basically people are doing and the major trends for human societies in the Arctic. We produced an internet website in 5 languages, which is quite unique, on major key issues of people and environmental change in the Arctic, which is well worth if you want to read about things in Icelandic or Danish, French, German, and English. The language is extremely important, not just because of the endangered languages of the Arctic, but also because of the need to disseminate information, disseminate research findings, and engage people, for example, in the Russian North. So we've, for example, translated the Arctic Human Development Report into Russian. Now, the Friendly Arctic exhibit is an exhibit we have traveled with. It's a joint venture, Dartmouth College and the Stefansson Institute traveled with all the way from the little town where my institute is based, Akureyri, Northern Iceland, to Monshire Museum of Science, to Manhattan, the Scandinavia House, and so forth. And we will be taking it will be the background for the joint launch of Denmark, Greenland, Faroe Islands, and Iceland of the International Polar Year on 1st of March in Copenhagen. Further on, we will be taking it very likely to Cambridge University, the Scott Polar Research Institute, which has been a major partner. Strangely enough, many of these projects include these 3 institutes, Dartmouth College Institute of Arctic Studies, the Scott Polar, and the Stefansson Institute. Not a bad bunch. And we're also engaged in a new International Polar Year project led by Ross and the Institute of Arctic Studies, focusing on dialogue, the changing Arctic and the dialogue between scientists and policymakers. Now, just to finish, Stefansson, of course, had a unique voice and a unique approach to the Arctic, seeing it as a friendly place rather than an uninhabited, barren, inhospitable wasteland. But the Arctic is a big place, but it does get media attention every now and then, thanks to people like Andy Revkin. I here have the New York Times from September 18th of 1915, where Stefansson is front page material. He suddenly reappeared after having been lost for a year and a half in the Canadian archipelago. That was the good news, that he was found. And so, without further ado, thank you very much.
Thank you, Niels. Dartmouth's achievements in Northern Studies have been inspired by the life of Stefansson, and we'll hear more about that as the evening proceeds. But it's also important to acknowledge the special role of Dartmouth's leadership in this success. President Jim Wright, through his consistent support of interdisciplinary studies and the high value he places on international outreach, has been truly a very good friend of Northern Studies. Jim, we were very delighted that you're with us here tonight to introduce the Stefansson Memorial Lecture.
Thank you, Ross. It's indeed a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you here in this full house this afternoon to the 7th Annual Stefansson Lecture. I'd like to extend, obviously, a welcome to Dr. Einarsson, Director of the Stefansson Arctic Institute of Iceland, and all of our guests who are here from abroad. But to Evelyn Stefansson-Neff, Evelyn, just such a delight to have you back here. Thank you for all that you have done here. Evelyn was very much a partner in establishing the Stefansson collection here and looking after it, and she has a deep and important role in the history of this program at Dartmouth. For many years, she and Steph called Hanover and this campus their home, and together they brought a vitality to the campus, a sense of energy to the campus, a passion for learning, a passion for sharing knowledge, that was evident in all of the activities that the two of them engaged in, the theater, the classroom, or indeed building igloos on the library lawn. You left quite a mark here in so many ways. You're outstanding teachers and educators, and we're just delighted to have you back here in our company. Today we honor the memory and the work, though, of Vilhjalmur Stefansson, a dear friend of the Arctic and of Dartmouth. Throughout his legendary travels, Stefansson introduced us to the complexities of the Inuit life, the subtleties and wonder of the Arctic, and in turn, he revolutionized our perceptions of that place that once seemed so forbidding and scary. It seemed fitting that such a renowned explorer and scholar could choose to make his home finally at Dartmouth College. For generations, Dartmouth students and faculty have used our natural setting as an extension of the classroom, and we're deeply involved in stewarding the natural resources of this region and indeed of the world, for which we assume a responsibility. Indeed, it was the work of the Dartmouth Outing Club that first attracted Vilhjalmur Stefansson to the college. In 1921, having heard of the Dartmouth Outing Club's aims, he presented several copies of his monograph to the student organization. And from that early contact beginning then, he went on frequently to visit the campus, to lecture at Dartmouth during the 30s and 40s, and he enthralled students and faculty with his knowledge, with the wisdom, with the experience that he talked about, and simply with his engaging presence on this campus. Dartmouth was an ideal place for Mr. Stefansson to continue his work, and eventually he was enticed to formally join the college as an Arctic consultant and to help us establish more firmly a studies program here. Over the ensuing years, he remained an avid lecturer, a prolific writer, using every opportunity to shatter illusions and dispel the myths that people had of the North Country. He engaged his audiences in a world that they could not have imagined, and he opened our eyes to the dynamic relationship between the polar regions and the rest of the Earth, and ultimately the price we might all pay for, as he said, what he described as our unwillingness to change our minds about the North. What a nice way of putting it, our unwillingness to change our minds about the North, locked in on certain perceptions about this part of the world. Stefansson was instrumental in the creation of the U.S. Corps of Engineers Cold Region Research and Engineering Laboratory, emphasizing the need to understand the science of cold regions and their global impact. And in 1952, through a gift from the Stefanssons, from Evelyn and Vilhjalmur Stefansson, and along with Albert Bradley of the class of 15, Dartmouth's library acquired the Stefansson Private Research Collection on polar exploration. Their generosity solidified Dartmouth's place as a leading center of Arctic studies and set the stage for collaborations with American, Canadian, and other scholars. Today, the Institute for Arctic Studies continues to educate and to inform. During the upcoming International Polar Year, which Professor Virginia described, Dartmouth will look to play a critical role in turning the world's attention to the dramatic and the rapid changes in the Earth's climatic system. Through dialogue and partnership with museums, libraries, and other Arctic institutes, we will extend Stefansson's legendary advocacy work and his tradition of discovery. Like Wilhelmur Stefansson, Andrew Revkin is anything but a passive spectator. He is a passionate participant. For nearly 20 years, he has covered the growing human influence on climate change. His travels have taken him from the Amazon basin to the North Pole, and in 2003, he became the first New York Times reporter to file stories and photographs from the top of the world. An outstanding writer, Mr. Revkin takes readers right into the heart of his subject. His reports and his books do not simply record and describe events, although they describe and record so well, but they also offer the reader a rich and full picture of the sights and sounds of life's joys, fears, and hopes. Through moving stories, he compels readers to see, as he has said, quote, the larger crime, the unbridled destruction of the last great reservoir of biological diversity on Earth. Mr. Revkin is the author of 3 books, including the award-winning environmental classic, The Burning Season, which chronicles the life of Chico Mendes, the slain leader of the movement to save the Amazon rainforest. Global Warming, Understanding the Forecast, which was joined with the American Museum of Natural History's exhibition on global warming, and earlier this year, he published a book to educate younger readers about the impact of global warming. The North Pole was here, Puzzles and Perils at the Top of the World. A highly recognized science journalist, he is a 2006 recipient of a John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship to support his ongoing work. He is also a 2-time recipient of the Science Journalism Award of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and he was the inaugural National Academy's Communication Award for print journalism. His cutting-edge reports utilize scientific discovery and political analysis and insights to underscore the human condition, and they've resulted in a provocative national dialogue. Mr. Revkin reminds us that the environment and our lives are inextricably linked, and as Wilhelmur Stefansson so often noted, our ability to change our perceptions will make the difference in our future. Mr. Revkin, welcome to Dartmouth.
I'm the one with the mic. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. When I was out on the sea ice here, standing on a 14,000-foot deep ocean with a guy named Jim Ossie, who's an engineer from the University of Washington, who you'll see in a few minutes, Ossie said to me that, reflecting back, he said, when you're up here, you can't not think about the people who came here before us, people like Stefansson and all the explorers who clawed their way north for various reasons. And he said today, all exploration today is kind of forced, because here we are 24 hours from Seattle, where he had just come from, and we're standing at the top of the world. And back then, you know, you'd have to endure a year or two just to get that far north, if you could even make it. So what I want to do is take you on my kind of learning curve as I've gone from the Amazon to the Arctic, from being not even interested in journalism to being now getting to be a quarter-century veteran of writing. And to kind of explore with you this moment. We've switched from a world in the 20th century when environmental problems were kind of in your face. When it was the Hudson River, where I live, was full of crap, basically. And you had to build a sewage plant to take it out. Or when the air was visibly tainted and you knew it was harming your health, so you did something about it. Now we're in a world where gases that we produce everywhere, a Bangkok taxi cab or the lights in this building, are generating gases that live for a long time in the atmosphere, trap heat, and are transforming places like the North Pole. A totally a weird world of teleconnections that we couldn't even have comprehended a few decades ago. And it's also truly teleconnections because right now we're shaping the climate of our grandchildren. So it's a connection through time as well as space. And I'm not sure we figured this all out yet, but I do think we have to give ourselves a little time. The learning curve is a steep one on this stuff. So, and right now, of course, climate change has the feel of breaking news these days. If you looked at some of the coverage this year, Al Gore's film, it's kind of like in your face, oh my God, it's happening now, it's real-time catastrophe. Well, here we are. I went through our clippings as well. When I was writing this book, the North Pole was here, and I went back and found in 1890, we were writing, there's something going on with the climate. What is it? And here, this is so remarkable because in 1890, the things that were significant then were different than the things that are significant now. This article was reporting on the failure of the ice crop in the Hudson Valley for the second year in a row. They actually, and it says here somewhere, all right, whoever expected to see another importation of ice from Norway after that of 10 years ago? So back then, the climate was warming, and there was a sense of something being weird and importing ice from Norway because you couldn't go hack it out of the river and put it in a barn until the summer. 1932, have you seen this kind of headline recently? Next great deluge forecast by science. In the 30s, there was one scientist who started to think that there was a human element to what was going on, although now science is quite clear that the warming in the early part of the 20th century looks like it was a natural consequence of various things. But it was definitely something noticeable, and also scientists were learning more about the grand scale of change on Earth, the ice ages and warm periods that were in the latter stages of one. This story blew me away. The year of my birth, 1956. I just joined AARP, which is a very disturbing thing. They kept sending me this stuff in the mail, and I finally said, oh, screw it, I'll do it. For the discounts. So here we are, 1956, and a reporter who's preceded even Walter Sullivan, the great the science writer who invented science writing at the New York Times. But here's a guy in 56 saying already carbon dioxide. He was quoting the work of Gilbert Plass, who was a climate physicist who was thinking about this stuff, and he was already saying that these carbon dioxide is building and it's going to change the climate. And this paragraph really blows my mind. This could have been in my story. I had this long piece in the paper on Monday on what do we do about this? How do you solve the climate problem? And here we have this remarkable sentence at the end of this story written 50 years ago. Coal and oil are still plentiful and cheap in many parts of the world, and there is every reason to believe that both will be consumed by industry so long as it pays to do so. That's where we are right now. Can we put a cap on carbon? Should there be a price on carbon so that there's less of an incentive to keep burning it? And here, 50 years have gone by, and we're still that learning curve is still there. So here's where I started my trip to the North Pole. In 1978, I graduated from Brown University. Some of my best friends went to Dartmouth, so forgive me, okay? I'm a Rhode Islander by birth, so it was just a shorter trip from home. And I got a degree in biology. I had no interest in writing. But I did get a traveling fellowship to go to Paradise. My proposal was to study man's relationship to the sea. This was a little thing I could do for a year after I got out of school. It was like a Watson fellowship. And again, when I grew up, I loved warm things. Summertime in Rhode Island, you ski in valleys, So skiing, cold stuff was not part of my makeup, except when I came here to visit my relatives, the Solos. So I headed south, and I got out into the world, and it was this trip that ended up lasting 2 years that made me want to be a journalist. I spent part of that time on a boat. I sort of literally, there was a boat in New Zealand with a sign that said, crew wanted, yacht wanderlust, heading to Mediterranean. So here we are in New Zealand, and the Mediterranean is up here, and I'm thinking, I still had some of this fellowship money in my pocket, and I was young and unattached, and by the way, for all those who are young and unattached, and have any chance to go anywhere remotely different than the place that you call normal, do it. By the way, that's me with that 70s hair and the very large fish. So things change. I still luckily have some hair. We traveled 15,000 miles on this trip and a year and a half. And I saw a lot of stuff. And the world was full of things that were making me want to do what journalists do, which is to tell stories, to tell people about what I saw. We crossed the Indian Ocean after going through Indonesia and Singapore, and I got dengue fever, and et cetera, et cetera. We got to the mouth of the Red Sea. Just below the mouth of the Red Sea is Djibouti, which is truly the ends of the earth, other than the North Pole. And Djibouti is a French colony, former French colony. All that's there is French foreign legionnaires and nothing else except extreme poverty. And then I was walking down the street, and I saw piles of leopard skins. Those are leopard skins, piled like rugs for sale by the side of the road. And this was along this trip, I kept seeing things that were making me realize that there was stuff that human beings were doing on the planet that were not what I would call sustainable. This was, again, before sustainable development was some term of art. But clearly, things are out of balance when you see piles of leopard skins by the side of a road. all bound for European tourists. And that started making me want to tell stories. I got back from this trip with all my photographs, and I took them down to National Geographic, and I thought, okay, I'm going to be a National Geographic writer and photographer. And it turned out I had just enough astigmatism that they were all a little bit out of focus. And so the photo editor I met with said, you really show some promise here, but And so I went to the journalism school at another Ivy League school, Columbia, and came out with some basic tools that allowed me to start writing. And one of the first places I started writing after some magazine work was the Los Angeles Times. This is Los Angeles for those in the back of the room. And when you're writing there, you're implicitly writing about the environment because there's something wrong with this picture, right? It's not out of focus either. And so I started focusing on the atmosphere. I was always writing about science from the very beginning, but I started focusing on the atmosphere and then the climate. And by the late 80s, climate change started to creep into my head. In the mid-80s, my first story on climate change was not about global warming. It was about global cooling. It was about nuclear winter. Remember the Cold War? Well, there was this idea that if enough cities were incinerated in a catastrophic nuclear war, that we would chill the planet enough to kill us all and disrupt life on Earth for generations to come. And so I wrote a story on climate, on nuclear winter. Then it turned out to be more nuclear autumn. And oops, story? No, journalism doesn't pay attention to nuclear autumn. We pay attention to nuclear winter. There's a lesson in that that'll come up later. But by 1988 is the year when climate change, global warming, finally made the headlines in the front pages of newspapers and magazines. And it was mainly not because the poles were melting. At that time, the thing that got into our head was not only we had a record heat wave in the northern hemisphere, but the Amazon was on fire. This is a picture taken from the space shuttle in the fall of 1988. And everything you see except for those big cumulus towers is smoke. It was a smoke cloud the size of India over the Amazon that summer. And that got our attention. And before I was at the New York Times, others, Marlise Simons particularly, were writing about this story. And it was a real no-brainer. You had fire and you had warming. And so it had pictures and it had all the elements that make for a story. And we kind of think now that this is all sort of newborn. Back then it was newborn also. And the Amazon intrigued me. Again, I was not yet an Arctic-ophile. I was a creature of the tropics. I loved reefs and rainforests. And finally, I got a chance to go down to this place. This is 2 satellite images, which I've been using, well, I guess as long as Al Gore has been using them in his PowerPoint, I've been using them in talks. But now that he's made them famous in a movie, I should just take them out of here so people don't think I'm copying him. Anyway, this is a satellite image of Rondonia, the state in the Amazon near where I ended up focusing my book. And this was just a few years later. And each one of those stripes is roads and then little feeder roads. This kind of fishbone pattern spreading is an image. There's something about this that is emblematic, again, of where we're at on the Earth. For so long, humans did our thing without leaving a lot of big global scale evidence. We polluted a little river here or fished out a lake there, but we didn't do stuff you can see from space until very recently. Keep that in mind. And at the end of each of those stripes, it looks like this. This was a picture I took when I was out with a forestry patrol in the Amazon. And these logs were illegally harvested. And look at this picture. If someone just you take away the logs and maybe get down a little lower so you don't see the fringe of forest in the background, it could be Iraq. But this is the middle of the Amazon in the state of Acre. It's just kind of remarkable to see how transformed a landscape can be when people get busy. So I ended up writing a book about the Amazon that came out in 1990, which is a long time ago. Then I wrote a book about global warming, which came out in 1992, which made it right after Desert Storm and right after Mount Pinatubo blew in the Philippines and cooled the global climate for several years. So I very wisely, my marketing skills are just great. Come out with your book on global warming when the globe cools temporarily. It kind of went away. So finally, I needed a day job, and the local paper had an opening in the metro section, and I dove in. I had an opportunity we created a beat in the region around New York City, a regional environmental beat. There hadn't been one, really, until I started there. And I really quickly dove into this culture of the newsroom and this culture of daily news. I'd been at that LA Times job just very briefly, and I really didn't absorb what a newspaper is like till I got to this one. And it's sort of like the Amazon, actually. You have the sunlight of the front page, and you have all these stories each day kind of trying to vie for that sunlight, and it's very competitive. It's like an ecosystem where everything's biting each other, and all the reporters are, no, my story is more important than this one. Of course, I feel my climate stories are the most important, but the guy covering Wall Street knows that his stories are more important. And everybody in the newsroom, outside the science section, knows all the rules of the game for all the other stories. In other words, we all kind of know that when there's a World Series result, you don't have to put into the story that, by the way, a baseball game has 9 innings. Each inning has 3 outs. Each out has 3 strikes. But with a climate story or a science story, because of where we're at with our understanding of science in this country and many others, you don't have the luxury of just assuming everyone knows stuff. So you have to cram that in and still get your story to compete with all these other stories, and it's really a nightmare. And then it comes out the next day, and it's kind of comprehensible, which is amazing. I'm sure, Christopher, there's probably some other reporters in the room too. It's a miracle that newspapers happen and are remotely comprehensible, let alone as good as we actually are pretty darn good at this stuff. And I'm very proud to have been at the paper for 1,000 bylines in 12 years. It's an amazing thing. But there are problems, and there are problems that really crop up, particularly for stories like global change, loss of biodiversity, all the problems that I think are going to characterize our environmental issues in the 21st century are not an easy fit for the newsroom because of certain things. There's these things. This, by the way, this section of the PowerPoint presentation is for the scientists in the room. You know, it's like words that I can go to and speak. The tyrannies of the news. I speak PowerPoint. The peg. The peg is something happened today. And you know, what is it about this story that makes me, the editor, need to put it in the paper today as opposed to next week or never? And then there's space and time. The crunch of space and time is the ultimate tyranny, because it's, as one editor said to me when I was learning the rhythms of writing for a daily newspaper, as I was late on my story, it was 6 o'clock, he's leaning over my shoulder going, "Revkin, this ain't no seed catalog." Jack Cadden. There's another New York Times reporter here, former. And he was right, you know. There's a point when those presses start to roll. You have to get it out. And then there's this tyranny of balance, which is such a pernicious fit for when you get science and you put it into the realm of the news universe. And so here's a paper that came out in the journal Nature today. And it says something, and you canvass a bunch of scientists, and so says it's really important, and then you have to look around for the one who says it's hooey. And you build your story. Something happened today. So-and-so says it's really important. So-and-so says, I'm not so sure. And you put that in the paper. And what does that actually told the reader? If we use that template for covering science, especially on nuanced issues with a lot of uncertainty like climate change, you end up, well, there's 2 ways the media have gotten it wrong. We either oversimplify or we ignore completely. Or 3 ways, actually. We oversimplify it and say, you know, the North Pole is melting and we know it's our fault. Or we oversimplify it, or we do the false balance thing where we get 2 guys even though there's this big consensus in the middle. And actually I want to show you, I'm going to go forward here. I recently had this little epiphany that essentially, it's probably old news for a lot of people, but for anything we understand, whether it's natural selection or tectonic plate motion, continental drift, global warming, there's a curve like this. And even for an issue like global warming, I'm going to back up now a slide. For global warming, whoops, I'm going the wrong direction. Oh, hold on. Stop. Oh, why is it going forward? Hold on, excuse me. I got to go backwards. Back up. Give me 1 second here. Too much technology. All right, here we go. Yeah, this should be like a law of physics. For every PhD, there's an equal and opposite PhD. You get the idea. Hurricanes, we got Kerry Emanuel and Christopher Landsea. And you know, as a reporter, if I'm in a hurry and some study came out, I know in a cheap, easy crutch kind of way, I can say the study came out. Kerry says it's really important. Chris says I'm not so sure. That's the trap that we can get into because of those other tyrannies. The tyranny, we have to prove to our editor it's really important, this new paper, even though maybe it's incremental in the way the sweep of science. And you end up, the reader doesn't get served by that at all. And if you do that with each study that comes out month after month on whether Greenland is gaining or losing ice, or whether hurricanes are our fault already or not, you end up with this, what I call whiplash journalism, where there's a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science that says this, and then there's one that says this. And what gets missed in all of that is that, I'm going to go back up to the curve. Oh, no. Here we go. I'm lost in my PowerPoint. What gets missed in all of that is for each of these aspects of a question, there is this. There is a body of understanding. And not only that, this bell curve is in motion. It's like a supertanker. So the bell curve of understanding for are humans an influence on the climate system now? In other words, do greenhouse gases exert an effect? Have we increased the amount of greenhouse gases in the air? It's a very robust curve, and there's a huge amount that we understand right here in the middle. But as journalists, if we do it the traditional way of journalism, we're focusing on the guys out here and the ones out here. And you can go home and build a story on that, and you've missed the whole consensus in the middle, which is what you've seen over and over and over again, I think, lately in the press, especially this year. And lately, sadly, I think a lot of my colleagues in the press have just been focusing at one end. And now some of them say you don't even need to talk to the other end. So that not only are they missing the consensus, not only are they missing the consensus, they're also kind of just skewing things in one direction at the same time. I'll give you an example. Even though there's a curve, even though we understand that humans are exerting an influence on the climate system pretty powerfully, if you say, are humans juicing up hurricanes, this curve has a different shape. It's much more flat. It's much shallower. There's a legitimate uncertainty about those more complicated issues that are the ones that we care about. Hurricanes, how fast our sea is going to rise, what's happening with Greenland's ice. Anyway, let's move ahead. Now, the exploitation of balance and uncertainty are things that are happening every day and have happened for a long time. 1998, industry understands these norms in our business. They understand that a little uncertainty goes a long way in the public discourse. And so in this issue, they actually hired people to sort of dispense that uncertainty in a very professional way, and they were very good at it. And even as recently as last year, people in the White House were inserting little waffle words in climate reports, just enough to convey that, well, maybe we don't know things that much. And that ends up also setting things back in a way. And luckily, someone inside the government gave me some of those articles. On the other side, environmental groups have tended to do another thing that exploits some of our norms. They, out there in the world of stuff that we can put into a story, there's the hot content, the emotional stuff, and then there's the sort of the dry statistics. Take polar bears, like this beautiful one, which is sitting back comfortably. In Al Gore's movie, there was that scene where the animated polar bear is drowning. And that's very powerful stuff. The idea that recently scientists have observed from helicopters drowned polar bears is kind of intense. So as a journalist, if you can exploit that to the hilt, or you can talk to a lot of polar bear biologists and realize, actually, polar bears in certain areas like Churchill, which is not even in the Arctic, it's below the Arctic, are doing poorly, but polar bears in other parts of the Arctic are not doing so poorly. So is it right for someone to go out and say they're going to go extinct in 30 years, as someone with a recent book did? Or is it better to be a little more nuanced about how you convey this stuff and say, polar bears are going to have a harder time in the Arctic as we move into a warmer world with retreating sea ice? It's easier to do the first thing as a reporter. It's easier to go hog wild with the hot stuff. But and it also doesn't get you on the front page as much. So it's kind of a drag in a way. And this is where we're left. With this world, the reader in this world of it's a real-time catastrophe or it's fantasy, where the reader, the public, the average person, the 260 million people who have not seen An Inconvenient Truth, it's been a very successful documentary, but it's been seen probably by a lot of people in this room, but there's a lot of other people in America who have not seen it. We end up in a world where you're kind of withdrawing from this sort of intensified discourse, which is all at the edges of that curve. Now, what I do in trying to suss out what we really know and convey what science can and cannot tell us is to get away from a lot of that stuff, which is usually, the closer you get to Washington, the more of that you get. And the farther away you get from Washington, and Greenland, I recommend to anyone, is a place to go to really understand nature at its purest is a wonderful tonic for all of that. So several years ago, and again, forced after all this time of loving the tropics, I was kind of forced north because that's where so much change is happening these days. And you've had retreats in sea ice that seem to be beyond the bounds of what we consider normal. You have increasing body of evidence from Greenland showing that the ice is flowing away quicker than snow is accumulating on the top. And so I go there. And Greenland is a remarkable place to go. Actually, to get there, for me, I went to Schenectady, New York, and there's an Air National Guard base in Schenectady. You get on a prop plane there, and 5 hours later, you're at the end of the last ice age. It's just kind of a stunning thing to get off a plane, as I'm sure some people have, much more routinely than I, and to see something like this. And to stand at the edge of an ice sheet that's twice the size of California, that's 13,000 vertical feet of ice in the middle, and that's been there for 100 or 2,000 years, and that's eroding, is kind of a phenomenal experience. And here I am with a glaciologist from Reno, from the Desert Research Institute. And you're thinking, what in the world, what kind of scam is it that has a Desert Research Institute glaciologist? Of course, when you talk to him, you realize that it's the dry places in the world that rely the most on frozen water as a resource, because they're getting their river water or their meltwater is a big, important part of their water supply. And so here we are. He's been doing a lot of work, Joe McConnell, up on the ice sheet. I bet someone here knows him. And here we are at the edge of it, standing, looking at this ancient ice crumbling away and into a river of sort of gray water heading to the sea. And it was a remarkable thing to be able to convey this too. And I try to do all my reporting these days in every possible medium. That's me with a video camera there, because there are a lot of younger people who aren't going to be reading the New York Times the old-fashioned way. And I just think it's important to tell stories in every way possible. And then I went to the North Slope of Alaska, foolishly in December, as you'll see in a minute. That's not a great idea. But the Arctic is, 24-hour daylight I'll take any day over 24-hour darkness. But I learned a lesson in looking at sort of doing my research on the North Slope, which is, again, sort of like, think back to the satellite images of the Amazon. We're changing the world in ways that are not perceptible and certainly not news on a day-to-day basis. And here is 1968, 77, 89, and 99. This is the oil infrastructure on the central part of the North Slope of Alaska. So in any one day or any one year, you're not noticing what's happening. But here we are 30 or 40 years after Prudhoe Bay, and we've transformed a big chunk of America's only Arctic shore into an industrial landscape. And it turns out that caribou don't mind it very much. There was some of the arguments against development there have been, it's going to disrupt ecosystems and all that. But what do you do when you have this kind of development and you can't make that argument? It becomes more of a values judgment on whether this is a good thing to extend into a national wildlife refuge, which is just off to the east there. But usually the arguments are more about things like the caribou calving rate, instead of is it right or wrong to derive our oil by doing more of this. I don't answer those questions, by the way. I just pose them, being a reporter. And again, what I love up there, like at the North Pole, is that there are scientists willing to go very far and to do very hard things just to collect basic information on what's going on. All of that expansion of the oil infrastructure on the northern slope of Alaska is endangered by climate change. It's the one place I've been where oil companies are concerned about global warming. Because what's happened up there is the frozen season, when you can roam across and do your seismic thumping and find your next oil well, has shrunk from 200 days a year to about 100 days a year in 30 years. So for the first time, there was a story to write that showed that the oil industry had some concerns about climate, but for an unusual reason. So here's Harry Bader, this wonderful, wacky scientist from Yale originally, who was working for the state of Alaska, and he's kneeling sort of kneeling at the altar of data here, just out there for hour after hour, pounding a metal rod into the tundra to see how hard it is. And then he was doing further tests. So they were going to run vehicles around in circles and come back in the summertime to see if they damaged the underlying plants. So this is Harry Bader again. And I think it's just as important to tell about the process of science as it is the findings of science. Here's a guy willing to, again, run in circles in front of a bulldozer in a ground blizzard on the North Slope of Alaska, just to get a little firmer idea of how rapidly it's thawing and that kind of thing. A remarkable man, and then he has quit the state of Alaska because the Department of Natural Resources in Alaska, by the way, in the state constitution there, the mandate is to maximize the exploitation of the resources of the state of Alaska. And then there's this little dash and it says, in the public interest. That's the only part of their mandate that could be implied to be environmental. And so he got discouraged after a while in doing that. By the way, this is what journalism looks like in 24-hour darkness. And this is, I turned the camera around very quickly, and it's kind of like Hannibal Lecter meets Sasquatch. And it's not, it ain't easy, but someone has to do it. So here we go now to the very top of the world, and it's worth noting that the sun set there on September 22nd or so at the North Pole. It's dark 24 hours a day now till March. And in 2000, I learned about this science project. This very intrepid team decided there's this big black hole of data. The only real understanding we have of what's happened in the Arctic Ocean underneath that sea ice on the top has come from nuclear submarines that were prowling during the Cold War. And it's very scattered data. It doesn't really tell you a lot, except that the ice has been getting thinner. So they wanted to get a sense of the dynamics of the Arctic Ocean. What's happening with the currents, those layers, this salty water, warmer water down deep, colder water up high. It's really complicated. You have water pouring in through the Bering Strait and out past Greenland. And so they wanted to drop instruments down through the sea ice at the North Pole, leave them there for a year, have them record data, then pull them out again. Do that year after year, and you're kind of doing a Harry Bader, but in the middle of the Arctic Ocean. You're doing consistent monitoring at a very hard place. And they figured out a way to do this. And so I said, can I come? And the first year they said no, and then the second year they said maybe, and it didn't work out. And the third year, finally, I was able to go with them. But before I went, I started boning up on the North Pole and the history of our understanding of the Arctic. And for many people here, some of this is old news, but for me it was fascinating to learn a few things. Of course, there was all this in the 19th century. The idea was that the Arctic Ocean, because of a warm current that swept past Scandinavia, there was an open polar sea. So if you just got past all that ice that kept killing everybody, all those early explorers, it'd be a really, really nice place. In fact, the New York Times had a story in 1854 or so of Elijah Kane, who had claimed to have spotted the open polar sea, and got even more people thinking about going up there. And then, of course, this fanciful artist said he had his, that's Lodestone Mountain in the middle. That's where the magnetic North Pole comes from, the iron in that mountain. And then in 1862, Thomas Nast, an illustrator for Harper's Magazine, came up with the idea, well, why don't we put Santa Claus at the North Pole in the summertime? So he started doing artwork that again, back then it was fine because no one had gotten there. The North Pole was largely an imaginary place. It was an imaginary place, except for in geography. And so why you could stash Santa Claus there. The Frankenstein's monster, where did he flee? In Mary Shelley's book, to the North Pole, because no one would ever find him again. And then that was the era, of course, of Lord Franklin. And I won't be singing his song, although it's one I sing sometimes. The people who were trying to get to it was the North Pole or the Northwest Passage as destination, as conquest. And then finally we get to the era of the comprehended Arctic now, these last few decades, thanks to increasing satellite data and of course you can get there now with submarines. You have a sense of what's happening, and there's a growing sense of change. This was the average minimum sea ice extent from the 70s onward. The red is sort of the outer edge of the Arctic sea ice cap. And then this is in 2002. You can see there's an awful lot of open water all around the edges of the continents. And that's a big deal if you rely on sea ice as a platform for hunting for seals, as polar bears do and as some Inuit still do. And by the way, this was not by far the worst retreat. It was 2005. 2003, 2005 were the biggest retreats of the sea ice. This year it kind of wasn't a record, but it's close. So as I said, by the way, this is the hot emotional content in my presentation. See, the poor polar bears have a harder time catching seals, and their body weight goes down, and they have harder time living through the next winter. So finally, I did get to go, and I got out my Cabela's catalog, that really great thick full year catalog, and bought all the cold weather gear and had many, many layers of stuff. And then the National Science Foundation gave me the outerwear and the bunny boots. And you get on a 15-ton airplane in northernmost Canada in Alert, and you start flying north until there is no more north. To get to the North Pole, basically you go north until you start heading south again. And then you land. And up there, every spring, this only happens in the spring because there's only one time at the North Pole when you come out of that 6-month darkness and the ice hasn't yet started to get slushy on the top from all the sunlight beating down on it. And the Russians come out, as they have for about 10, 15 years. They set up a camp that's mainly for tourists, as you'll see in a second. And the scientists use that as a bit of a hub. And they scraped a runway in the flattest, longest sea ice slab they could find that we landed on. And then all the weird stuff starts happening. This is Jim Ossie, the guy I was telling you, who said all exploration these days is kind of forced. So right, we flew to the North Pole in a matter of 2 hours, 2.5 hours from northernmost Canada. We landed at the Russian airport. By the way, time at the North Pole is set at Moscow time. Of course, it could be any time because it's 24-hour daylight. And then we got there right in time for Russian Orthodox Easter. This is midnight. This is dawn on Russian Orthodox Easter. There was one of the camp workers was dressed as Santa Claus. And the woman there is Natalia Lieberman, who was the runner-up in a beauty pageant in Moscow. The winner turned down the prize, which was a trip to the North Pole. And Natalia did not. She actually, she had been in the same tent I was in for 24 hours already, with a bunch of Moscow millionaires who were there to shoot an AK-47 and to go skydiving at the North Pole. But they were all dressed in, she wasn't dressed like this. And then she came out of the tent like this. And I was like, oh, my God, this is bizarre. And this was the canteen at the North Pole. Again, you'll see in a minute. Apparently, the year before we were there, the food was provided by a French crew. When we were there, the food was provided by Russians. It's like, well, I'll leave it at that. So we were very happy. Actually, we were very happy when a crew of ski trekkers who had just skied 60 miles on the ice came in. They were Canadians, and they came in with all this gorp and cheese. And we were like, oh, can we have some? And that's all weird enough. But what you're reminded of quickly after you've been up there for more than 24 hours or so is that you're not on the tundra. It looks like tundra. It's sort of white and austere and silent. And then weird stuff starts happening. This picture was taken about 4 hours before this picture was taken. So the helicopters are there. Our tents are over here. It gets, again, it's a dynamic place. And you think of you look on a map or you read a book about the Arctic Ocean, and you think that sea ice up there is just sort of a unity. It's a big sheet of ice. But in fact, it's like a Scrabble table full of Scrabble tiles, each one the size of this campus in some cases. And they're in motion. And the North Pole was here, that sign. You'll see more of that in a minute. The reason that it said North Pole is here and then got changed to was is because we were drifting about 400 yards an hour. So we are literally on a raft of ice. And then listen to the next, hopefully the sound will work here.
Things you can see from space very clearly.
All the sound you hear is the ice.
You can feel the chunk that we're on actually starting to fail a bit more. Probably airline cracks up the
So airline cracks.
Yeah.
You can always jump over a crack. Great. He's been doing this for many, many years. That's Tim Stanton, an oceanographer from the Naval Postgraduate School. But it's astonishing to be, there, and you hear. I heard these sounds in the distance. It started out like almost like a hooting bird, like just this, and then it built into this crescendo.
The power is just, it's unstoppable. There's no mechanical system you could really design to live through a thing like this. The forces are just stunning. And it's the risk we take.
Listen to this part. I had a lot of video gear with me. It sounds like someone's trying to start an old truck. So the thing that's so remarkable is, again, there were a lot of tourists there going to do skydiving, and there were marathon runners at the North Pole when I was there. But these guys are trying to do science amid all of this stuff, which is just, science is hard enough anywhere, but to try to collect data in a consistent way, in a routine way, at a place where nothing is routine, is an enormous challenge. But they were doing it. This is the science camp. There was no beauty queens or whatever. This is about 40 miles away from that base camp. And the way you collect information on the Arctic Ocean when you're standing on sea ice is you melt a hole through the ice. It's about 7 feet thick right where this hole was melted. And you have to keep sieving out the grease ice or the slush, so, or otherwise the hole will melt, will freeze shut in a matter of an hour or so. And you drop some instruments down. And this is what happens now once a year with this NSF project. It's about 2 miles of Kevlar line with an anchor on the bottom, floats on the top, and a brilliant array of instruments that allow you to collect a year-long portrait profile of the Arctic Ocean conditions. An amazing bit of innovative science. And then you come back a year later. Because of the miracle of GPS, you know where to come back to, because you can't just leave a flag there on the moving ice. And you signal it with an acoustic beacon to let go of the anchor. It all comes floating up under the sea ice. Now the next thing is how do you get it out? Well, that's where Jim Ossie, the guy who was dancing with Santa Claus, puts on his diving gear, along with another guy. And there's several crews of divers who rotate through this program. And this year, when they had a lot of tangled line and real trouble because of ridges of underwater ice. It took 42 minutes of underwater diving for them to collect the gear this time. And this is their view of the North Pole, which to me is, you know, I didn't take these pictures, and my wife is very happy about that. It's astonishing to think of these guys routinely going underneath that crunching, moving, shifting sea ice into an ocean that's 14,000 feet deep. Just to think 10 Empire State Buildings. And you've got this sort of bottomless blackness below you and this green weirdness above you. And again, Jim said it's the closest thing he'll ever experience to being in outer space, he's sure. It's just a remarkably weird feeling. And they pull their data out and they do it again, and they do it again. And it's a program that's hard to keep funded. It's not cheap to do this. It's about $1 million a year. And it's not even clear that we don't know yet whether it's going to produce monumental science. None of this is Nobel Prize winning science. This is the hardest grunt work of science. It's basic, just getting a portrait, a little few years of a sense of what the dynamics are in the Arctic Ocean there. And then my job, when after confronting all this stuff, is really easy. Here I am in the North Pole Bureau of the New York Times, on deadline, filing with this, satellite phone modem is about. Do you remember like 1995, that dial-up and the 9600 baud? Anyone even know what 9600 baud feels like? But to send a photograph that way takes forever, and the signal kept breaking. But again, this was easy compared to the science. And then it's time to pack up because, as we all know, the Arctic Ocean increasingly in summer is not a place where you can rely on the ice to stay firm or to be able to stand on it, and certainly not to land an airplane on it. So the camp kind of decamps, and I've been writing since then about aspects of this issue. It's still, the Arctic Ocean changes right now. It feels quite momentous. It feels like it's totally consistent with what the models say should happen in this century, that we would end up having ever more open water, ever less ice, and that, as I say in the book, we're getting to a point where later in the century, there's a decent prospect that we'll have an open ocean at the top of the world for the first time in summer, instead of this ice-cloaked place. That open polar sea of the imagination in the 1800s might actually come to pass. We spent a huge amount of time last year writing on the implications of Arctic climate change. Did a big series called The Big Melt on everyone suddenly, it's as if all these superpowers had their back doors closed, facing this northern landscape that was not really usable. And now suddenly everyone's thinking, oh, law of the sea, whoa, what's under the... And there's some evidence that there's oil under, maybe, the very preliminary evidence that even in the deep basins of the Arctic Ocean, there's the potential for oil, which some of the scientists who did the studies that found that were very uncomfortable about talking about that aspect of what they found. So basically my beat from here on in is going to be this increasingly human-modified planet, and not just the Arctic. It's the same kinds of sort of slow drip changes are happening everywhere. We're transforming landscapes. We're transforming the biosphere in a big way. I've picked these images. They're both from Florida because they have implications that are fascinating. The one at the top, I'm sure some of the younger people here know what that is. It was in the Everglades. People have been releasing their pet pythons once they outgrow their houses in Florida in the Everglades. And this is a Burmese python, about 12 or 14 feet long, that tried to swallow an alligator And the alligator burst out from the python, and they both perished in the process. So we now have, and by the way, Burmese pythons really like the Everglades. They're propagating down there, apparently. And there are American bullfrogs now running around Bordeaux, France. And of course, we have the avian flu, and we have diseases that are moving around. We've become kind of a wearing blender for biology. So climate is just one of the many systems globally that we're fiddling with, it appears. Down here, but it's all sort of a mixture of outcomes. Just as the Arctic changes are probably going to result in, they could result in a lot of sea level rise if Greenland ice loss accelerates. They'll result in open passages and seaways that could cut off thousands of miles, and there could be all kinds of opportunities as well as problems. Here we have manatees. Manatees, I wrote a story about manatees a few years ago. In Florida, manatees used to eat seagrass around Tampa. The seagrass all went away when the water became turbid because of human activity. Now they eat water hyacinth, which was an invasive species. So the manatees are thriving in Florida by eating an invasive species, not because we kind of took away their traditional fodder. It's a very strange world we inhabit now, and it's going to be increasingly strange as we head toward 9 billion or more people, all who want to be like us, have sort of a climate-controlled, mobile, prosperous life that is largely facilitated by energy. So we face some really big choices, and they're happening now. There are things that are being locked in now that will determine significantly whether we have a really outsized impact on the global climate particularly, or have a lesser impact. China is building a power plant a week, and it's coal, and they're not even preserving the real estate that they'll need to put in the carbon capturing technology if we succeed in inventing it. But if you don't have the real estate set aside even to place that stuff, and then you're locking in emissions for decades to come that are going to matter a lot. And at the same time, 2 billion people on this planet today don't have any fossil energy, and as a result live pretty harsh lives. There's something like 1.5 million women, mainly women and children, who die young every year by breathing indoor pollution from wood and dung fires, like this picture in India. And for them, a fossil fuel would be a wonderful thing. So most of the scientists I talked to for that long story I wrote the other day say, in essence, what has to happen, what would need to happen, is for the developed world, the rich countries, to cut our emissions even more sharply than we would otherwise have to do so, to allow for growth in emissions, appropriate growth in emissions in developing countries so that they can grow their way out of poverty. And how do you get that to happen in a world that's flat? Whereas, as my colleague Friedman says, we're all competing with each other, and we don't want to give China an advantage by cutting our emissions in a more costly way. And the other options, of course, come with consequences too. As we tried to spell out in that story the other day, windmills, unless you want the entire neighborhood and all the hills around Hanover to look like that, can be a problem too. And then how do you store that energy when between the times when the wind is not blowing? There are big questions to come. And one thing I've become convinced of, and one reason I wrote the book, my new book on the Arctic and on climate, for young readers is, this really hit me when I was at the Montreal Climate Talks a year ago. The next round is starting in Nairobi next week. And I saw, this is our delegation. And do they look constipated, or is that my imagination? The kids, there were hundreds of kids there, young people from campuses like this one, from around the world, who'd come there to say, they had a nickname for the negotiators, the kids did. They called them fossils. And there are more than a few in this room, including me. We are of a generation that I'm not sure is going to make that transition to thinking globally, that's going to be willing to give up the comforts of being able to get into my minivan. I own a minivan, I admit it. And take my kids to soccer and do all those things that now make our modern life so convenient and wonderful. And I just feel like if I'm not telling the story of climate change for everyone involved, meaning young people, the next generation, then I'm not really doing my job. And I was glad to see that the New York Times, the book is co-published by the New York Times and Houghton Mifflin. The Times, I think, is recognizing that the next generation matters for journalism too, if we want people to keep reading newspapers. So it's a handoff that's happening here. We're handing off a climate to the next generation now. If they're not engaged and telling us that they're not pleased with the current trajectory, then I don't think we're going to change on our own. So I'm hoping that young people will get energized and start pressing us a little bit about what's going on here, because it is their world we're playing with. And I'm going to stop there. And I thank you. We're going to have time for questions, I hope. And I am going to sing a song because, I said I'm multimedia. Thank you, Christopher. Christopher Wren lent me a guitar. I'll keep this quick. In my spare moments, there are spare moments, when I'm not doing reporting, I write songs. Actually, it's a great counterpoint to what I do during the day because it's fun. Oh, this is nice. This is brand new. So, by the way, every time I sing this particular song, I have to issue a disclaimer. This song has no relationship to the New York Times Company or any of its affiliates. And I do this as a private citizen, kind of like Jim Hansen when he talks about climate policy. He has to say, "Don't worry, I'm not speaking for NASA." It's called Liberated Carbon. It took 1,000 generations for our species to rise, but gathering and hunting was no way to get by. We yearned to burn more than dung and sticks. Then Satan came along and said, "Hey, try lighting this." He opened up the ground and showed us coal and oil. He said, "Come liberate some carbon, it'll make your blood boil." Liberated carbon, it'll spin your wheels. Liberated carbon, it'll nuke your meals. Liberated carbon, it'll turn your night to day. Come on and liberate some carbon, babe, it's the American way. Now I got peat swamp fossils running my TV. Satan's black label burns in my SUV. We can light up the planet like a Christmas tree. Hey, hey, they say that things are getting hot, but hey, we've got AC. Well, liberated carbon, it'll spin your wheels. Liberated carbon, it'll nuke your meals. Liberated carbon, it'll turn your night to day. Come on and liberate some carbon, baby. Liberate some carbon, baby. Liberate some carbon, babe. It's the American way. Thank you. Yeah. So questions? Oh yeah, thank you. Any questions? I was a little fragmented in the middle there. I got lost in. So I would imagine you might have a question. Anything? Yeah, right there.
When we're talking about global warming and global climate change, we also address the global population. Our population needs resources to continue its advancement in technology and society. As our population reaches an ever-growing number, we will reach the Earth will reach a sustainable limit. What then happens when we reach that limit? Which is the greater evil here? When we reach that limit, what will happen? Will global warming be our focus, or will everyone needing the same resources be our focus?
I'll repeat the question. What happens when we reach, well, you might call it carrying capacity or basically overload, when, were you saying which is worse? Well, climate change is sort of a slow motion thing. And there are things that will happen before climate probably kicks into high gear that will create conflicts that will be significant. Like, for example, in the piece, when I was reporting this story that ran in the paper the other day, Roger Bezdek, B-E-Z-D-E-K, who's a really interesting thinker on this stuff, he said we're facing 3 problems in this century related to energy. One is the developing countries need a lot of it, and there's not enough, at least from non-fossil sources. The other is climate, and the other is the end of cheap oil. Essentially, whether or not the Hubbard's peak is a red herring. The end of adequate oil is here now. And that he said, he and many other people feel that that will lead to significant conflict and disruption and economic breakdowns well before climate kicks in to be sort of the second punch of later in the century. So we have to, now some people say two things. Energy policy, having a big push on research at every stage, energy options at every stage of development makes sense for multiple reasons. So do it, do it, do it. But one thing that has to also be considered is there's an MIT group that's looking at energy options who's made the point that in our rush to solve that first one, the lack of oil, if we start turning coal into oil, for example, here, that can actually exacerbate the climate change problem. So it becomes a very complicated mix of, you can have one priority actually making the other things worse. So it's going to be, it's an interesting century, let's put it that way. But energy is the answer to every aspect of it. If there's some way to tailor a career to address some facet of the energy question, and it's biology, it's the genome, it could come from anyone, as I said in that piece on Monday, it could be, they're the ideas that we haven't even thought of yet, energy options that we don't have a name for. So there's great opportunities as well as peril.
I was wondering if you could tell me to what extent countries share their alternative development strategies or their energy strategies, or is there what kind of sharing is there?
There's not a lot of sharing. It's especially when a resource gets more and more scarce. You're going to see more and more harboring of that resource. Right now, Russia is very flush with energy options, and there have been stories in the Times and other papers just recently saying that changes the whole dynamic of Europe's relationship with Russia is changing because Europe needs Russia for its energy, which is, some people feel that's why Putin has been able to exert more power, because he knows no one can really complain if he becomes more autocratic. So you're going to see more, the people who've got it will either wield power more like that, or they'll hold on to it more as well, or they can select where it goes. So it's, again, it's not, sharing is not a great global tradition so far.
Are there any companies or businesses that try to share?
Well, one reality of the climate question is that it will not be solved unless the wealthy, technology-enabled countries essentially share their technological advances with those that are less, don't have that capacity yet. And in fact, Roger Bezdek, he's on a National Academy of Sciences committee studying China and energy, and he said that the one thing that that could be the best benefit for the climate is for China to institute intellectual property rights. It seems so, you say, why is that? Well, that's because no one is going to put their advanced technology into a country where they can't protect their proprietary rights in that technology. So that's an interesting kind of, there are all these layers of things that don't seem obvious on the surface that can really matter like that.
As somebody who's in the business of describing for objectivity, how do you evaluate an inconvenient truth?
How do I evaluate an inconvenient truth? Well, I look at it this way. My newspaper has three components. There's news stories, there's the voice of the paper, the editorials, and then there's op-eds. An inconvenient truth is an op-ed. It's carefully chosen. It's an argument for a policy, for a worldview. He's very careful in there not to be non-factual, but he's very careful to only deal with facts that support his premise, which is that we right now are experiencing a planetary emergency now. I think there's a lack of confidence in a certain part of the environmental community that we can adequately respond to a long-term risk like climate change. If it's accurately portrayed as our grandchildren's problem, we're still not, I think people have a lack of confidence that we can act on that, and so they're trying to torque it into being a real-time problem. And so that's where I think he's done. It's very lawyerly. When I wrote about it in the paper, I described it as lawyerly. I think he's got a law degree, didn't he?
Yeah, it's interesting that you made that comment about China having a power, building power plants bi-weekly, because there was a story in in some newspaper about China being 8 years away from tapping into fusion and energy. Do you have any comments on that?
I hadn't heard about fusion, but China has more PhDs coming out of its universities right now by far than we do, and they're definitely pushing very hard on all these fronts. I'd have to ask my colleague Dennis Overby, who writes about physics and just came back from China recently, so I just don't know the answer on fusion. But
Anybody heard that?
anyone hear that? Stay tuned. I will ask Dennis Overby. Send me an email. No, I'm serious. In the middle there.
What has the New York Times learned? What kind of conversations have you been involved in or heard about controversial science-based issues? Is coverage going to change because of the lessons learned with respect to the three problems, the false balance, et cetera?
We're slowly adjusting. I think it's still a battle, as any journalist anywhere will tell you, to get a nuanced story with subjects that have uncertainty into the competitive news hall. It's hard. We just ran 6,000 words. We had that, I don't know if you saw it, 2 weeks ago, we had this Sunday story on mental illness focused on a family. It had all the elements. It was all hot content, all the emotional stuff. It's an easy sell to the front page editor because it's about something we all care about, the idea that there's a growing number of kids with severe mental illness. And it's spread over 2 pages. And I'm selfish as I cover the environment, and so I'll freely say I felt that my story on Monday, which was 1 page, and was cut and cut and cut again, cut and cut and cut, and ran on a Monday and not on Sunday, I thought it deserved Sunday and more display. But I know what I'm up against, and so we're not. We gave it display. We have a year-long series running right now on the Energy Challenge, which has had great stories in it about China's coal trends and all this stuff. Most of the stories have been on the front page. So I think we've passed some hurdles, at least with the climate energy story, in terms of getting column inches in the paper. There's lots of other lessons we're learning all the time on other fronts, like what happened leading up to Iraq, et cetera. But that's for another day.
Do you think the recent report out of Britain on the resource impact of climate change is going to help the balance?
The question was about the Stern review, which I wrote about Monday. This is this economic analysis of the costs of acting on climate change versus the costs of not acting. That report has a lot of problems. It was the I hinted at this in my story, but a lot of economists are dissecting it and finding all kinds of weaknesses in it. They're very clearly trying very hard to make a case that it's extraordinarily calamitous and costly, eventually, if we don't start promptly on cutting emissions very sharply. And it's just, when you look at the numbers, they've kind of pulled an Al Gore. And a careful analysis, I've seen, basically, if you think that climate forecasting is bad, economic forecasting. Again, I refer to you, there was a 2002 paper by Roger Bezdek. I don't know why I keep coming back to him. He did a paper on 50-year retroactive look at energy forecasts. And from 1950 till now, and it's worse than throwing darts at a map. It's just astonishing. And people get paid big money to do this stuff, and there's no such thing as an energy forecast. So how do you forecast a 100-year cost or benefit of any action right now with any sense of certainty? And what's happened in some of these forecasts like that one, they try to imply more certainty than is really there. So whether it catches hold, I don't know. One or two more? One more?
I have a question. I'm trying to balance between the Revkin, the folk singer, and the nuanced, balanced New York Times reporter.
So am I.
Sort of critique that's suggested in the song of the American way, and even having a kind of religious component. And I'm wondering where someone like Bill McKibben, who would probably be perhaps closer to the folk singer, and the the severe critique of more and more and more, where you see that fitting in, especially in terms of the bell curve that you described.
You mean in my own, how I focus what I do, or?
And then objectively.
Well, I do think in the end this all comes down. Science just lays out the landscape, and there are some people who choose to ignore the science that's inconvenient, whether they're coming at it from Al Gore's point of view or from the White House's point of view. But ultimately, all the choices that we're going to make as a society, as individuals coming through this century, will be based on values. It really comes down to how much do you value the future. That's the one, I've written about climate now for 20-something years, and it still always boils down to that. And that is the equation that determines how much you're willing to invest now as an insurance policy to limit future risk, because it is a risk management issue. We're not going to solve the climate problem. It's all about managing risk and limiting the worst case outcome. And that all comes back to your values. And that's why I don't think, I mean, you could hear that and then say, so why are you still writing science stories? I do think the science helps to frame the choices that then have to be made based on your values. So you still need to have a firm sense of the landscape, and as firm as you can. But you also need, the other thing that we have to get rid of is the idea that there'll be sort of perfect certainty anytime soon. So much of what I do as a journalist every day is the fiction of what we do is that we're somehow portraying that now we know. Now we know what's happening with Greenland. But remember, it's like whiplash if you try to imply that now we know. We know that there's a trajectory of understanding on the things that matter. We know that more carbon dioxide, even Richard Lindzen in the Wall Street Journal in April, in attacking climate alarmists like Al Gore, he had one section in there, what do we agree on? Meaning we, the science community. He agreed that more carbon dioxide will make the world warmer. So more carbon dioxide, warmer world, less ice, higher seas. Those basic foundation facts are there, and they're not even a bell curve. They're like a pillar in terms of the narrowness of agreement on the basics. And when you boil it down like that, then the values judgment is there. I mean, there is a risk of warming, and there is a risk that will lead to changes that will make for a profoundly different world for coming generations. And then it comes down to what do you do about it, and that's really not a scientifically definable answer. In fact, there's a fiction too. I'm just going to close with, we had this agreement that underlies the Kyoto Protocol that we're all signatories to, including the United States. The Framework Convention on Climate Change, signed way back by George Bush's father, has this grand and glorious goal, which is to avoid dangerous anthropogenic influence on the climate system through greenhouse gas buildup. But it doesn't define dangerous, because they knew right from the get-go that China, the United States, Bangladesh, Maldives, everyone is going to have a different definition of how much is too much. And that's why, even on the level of global diplomacy, I'm not so sure that another round of climate treaties is going to be the thing that will push us forward. But it will come down to what do you want to do? How much do you value the future? So thank you again for listening. Thank you.